So in looking at pitcher wins above replacement, we need to make some standard adjustments to what we're doing. We need to adjust for the park that the pitcher is pitching in and also the league context. So park and league adjustments need to happen to pitcher WAR. Baseball Reference also does an opponent adjustment, the strength of schedule adjustment, how easy or hard the opponents are for that pitcher. So the other big question here is starters versus relievers. We talked about this briefly in a previous video, but starting is more difficult than relief pitching. And fundamentally, this comes from looking at relievers who become starters and starters who become relievers. They have better numbers in relief, and it's probably a function of the ability to throw harder because you know you're not going to be throwing as long as a starting pitcher would. You might have a different strategy as a relief pitcher in terms of maximizing effort, and a starter might be pitching to contact in many contexts. So, bottom line, the pitching numbers for relievers are better than the pitching numbers for starters. So, the replacement level for a reliever is actually higher than the replacement level for the starter. Starter replacement level is lower because it's a harder job. Because relief pitchers have higher numbers, they've got a higher replacement level. When you look at the winning percentage for starters, the replacement level for winning percentage is much lower. If you're a pitcher who has a .380 winning percentage, that's replacement level. But to be a replacement level relief pitcher, you've got to have a winning percentage close to 500. It's got to be 470. So relief pitcher's replacement level is much higher. So you've got to understand that when we adjust for starters versus relievers, they have a much different replacement level because of the numbers that they generate. Finally, we talked about the context of runs to wins. Pitchers' skill determine their runs to win conversion. A replacement level pitcher runs to wins is going to be much different than the runs to wins for the most skilled pitcher in the game. Pedro Martinez, your Clayton Kershaws, your Sandy Koufax. Those pitchers have a much different runs to win conversion because they're not allowing many runs, so their offense doesn't need as many runs when they're pitching to win the game. So runs to wins adjusts to pitcher skill, pitcher talent. So for hitters, there's one run to win conversion. For pitchers, they influence their own run environment because they control it. So a pitcher who has high skills doesn't need to generate as many runs in the runs to wins conversion as a pitcher that has lower skill. Finally, this is probably the slide that I would commit to memory if I were trying to be an expert in pitcher WAR. There's two major competing systems to get at pitcher WAR: Fangraphs and Baseball Reference. One uses FIP, which is strikeouts, walks, and home runs. One uses this generalized runs metric that doesn't account for errors or worry about official scores, but does include defense. It's an all-encompassing metric to get at the runs allowed by a pitcher. FIP doesn't include always runs allowed. It's more a skill metric. Neither of them is completely right. Neither of these systems is completely wrong. But you start there. Once you start there, you adjust for park, you adjust for the league, And Baseball Reference, with their runs allowed per nine, RA9, they adjust for the opponent, and they do a defensive adjustment based on the team's season defensive skills, defensive measurements. Then you subtract from the replacement level. This is essentially very similar to what we talked about with position player WAR replacement level adjustments, but you do a replacement level adjustment, but it's very different for starters and relievers. You've got to understand the difference in the numbers generated by starters and relievers and how that's going to change this replacement level adjustment. Then you do an adjustment for leverage, the leveraged index, the situation for relievers. Finally, you divide by runs per win. You do the final conversion of measuring runs either with the FIP model or with the runs allowed per nine model. You take your runs, you divide by runs per win, and you get wins. You get the wins above replacement. Now this, again, is determined by pitcher quality. The runs per win metric, the runs per win conversion is more complex in pitching than it is for the positional players. So this is a slide that is a nice summary of pitcher WAR. I hope the student learner got a sense of the challenge of measuring wins above replacement for pitchers.